Okay, so today we are going to take a detour. There we go. Starting today, we are going to take a detour from our trip through the biblical narrative to park for a little while here in the days of Solomon. There are 3 books in the Bible that are associated with Solomon, plus a couple of Psalms. And those are Proverbs, Eccelesiastes, and the Song of Solomon. And so we're going, and the Psalms are 72 and 127, I believe, that have his name on them. So we're going to spend some time looking at this material. We're going to read through it before we go back to continuing our journey through the actual biblical timeline. We are about halfway through the Bible. We are about halfway through the narrative. The biblical story really starts with Abraham. God's call to Abraham to come out from Ur of the Chaldees and go to the land that God will show him, which ends up being the land of Canaan there on the Mediterranean coast. That's kind of the beginning of our timeline, of our biblical history. Yes, there is a period of time before that. The material in Genesis goes before that all the way back to the very beginning, but for all intents and purposes, our story really, that's a prologue. That's just the beginning. Our story starts with the call of Abraham. That happens about 2000 BC, somewhere in the 1900s BC or so. Okay. Christ, of course, will come along in the year 1 AD. Okay, that's what BC stands for, before Christ. So that's 2,000 years away from Abraham. When Abraham is called out of the Ur of the Chaldees, Christ is about 2,000 years into the future at that time. Of course, the actual biblical story goes up to the first century or so of the AD era, of the Christian era, the common era we call it today. So the actual Bible timeline in terms of the written history goes from about the year 2000 BC or 1900 BC to about the year 100 AD. So about 2,000 years. Solomon lives in the 900s BC, so he's almost exactly halfway through the timeline, from Abraham until the first generation of the church, which is where the written history of the New Testament ends. Solomon is pretty much right at the halfway point. He comes in the 900s BC after David, and is pretty much like right in the halfway point along this 2,000-year journey we're taking through history here. So it's an important moment. Now, and also not only that, but the days of Solomon, we talked about this briefly when we read about the temple, and we read about the description of the temple and its decorations and its furnishings and the items that were built for it and the design of the items. And we mentioned how it had a lot of garden imagery in it. There were trees, there were pomegranates, there were animals, bulls, lions, there were angels, cherubim. Okay, the entire design of the temple was to evoke strong imagery of the garden. You would have these, lily-shaped decorations or pomegranate-shaped decorations or palm tree-shaped decorations, ox, bulls, lions, cherubim worked into the walls, and you would just have seen like this mixture of all the elements that would have been in the garden back in Genesis 2 and 3. And that goes into, and we see a lot more of that in these works of Solomon. As we go through these works of Solomon, these written works attributed to Solomon, we have to put ourselves in a garden mindset, okay? And think of it also in this way. In the days of Solomon, Israel came closer than they ever had before or ever would again to recapturing Eden. All right? This period of time, after David has won all of his battles and handed over the kingdom to Solomon, and Solomon reigned in peace, this period of time is probably as close as we ever came anywhere in our history of mankind to recapturing the paradise-like state of Eden, or the delight of Eden. And so there's going to be a lot of callbacks to that. And just as how in Eden there were 2 trees that were put in the middle of the garden, that, the right tree to eat from and the wrong tree to eat from, and they ate from the wrong tree, over and over in these works of Solomon, we're going to see this option presented to the reader, to the person that's consuming the material, the hearer, the listener, really, because they weren't reading it back in those days, they were hearing it, to choose rightly, to choose the right path, the wisdom, the choice to choose good and not evil, unlike what we did back in the garden. So we do need to put ourselves in a garden mindset here. Now, Solomon, in the end, is going to make the wrong choice. He will give us all, and he'll admit that when we get to Ecclesiastes, he'll acknowledge that he did all these things. He filled himself up with the wrong choice. So just because Solomon has written all this stuff down doesn't mean he was infallible to making the wrong choice, because he certainly was able to do that, and he did do that later in his life. So we're going to see this contrast presented, and we're going to see it laid out very starkly at the beginning of Proverbs, and we're going to keep, what in the, okay, and we're going to, sorry about that. So we're going to see that choice offered to us as we go through these books. Put ourselves in a garden mindset. We are back in the garden. We are back in paradise, where there is communion with God and with others between man and wife. Song of Solomon is always about that, and we see elements of that in Proverbs as well. And if we choose rightly, if we choose to eat of the right tree, the tree of life, the tree of life is going to be mentioned in Proverbs. We're going to hear the tree of life referred to in Proverbs for the first time since Genesis. And so we're at the midway point of our narrative, and we are looking back to the past where we had the choice in the past to choose correctly. We didn't choose correctly then, but we can still choose correctly now. We can still choose to do good and not evil. It's not going to keep us from dying. It's not going to keep, as we'll read about in Ecclesiastes, even choosing the right path is not going to keep us from dying. It is not going to keep us from wasting away in our physical bodies and eventually succumbing to the decay and entropy of death as everything does. Like, that's not going to save us from that. And Solomon doesn't have an answer to that. At this point in time, God still has not revealed to Solomon or anybody else what he plans to do about death. That's part of the revelation that is still yet to come. Solomon does not have an answer to death. But we can put ourselves in the mindset of someone in the garden, someone who is living as close to the ideal envisioned by God way back at the beginning as we ever have here in the days of Solomon. And we still have that choice in front of us to choose between wisdom or folly, between good or evil. Before I get started, I'll go ahead and start a new video here in a moment. I will say there really, honestly, isn't a lot of reason to doubt these books came from Solomon. And of course, the smart people today will tell you they didn't. But there really isn't any reason to doubt that. The Proverbs says it very specifically. It's from Solomon. It has his name in it a few different times. Now, the very end of Proverbs has the last couple chapters, has a couple of other names associated with it that say these are the writings of Agur or Lemuel or whoever. Who knows who those people are. But the rest of the book is attributed to Solomon very clearly and emphatically, like several times. They mentioned Solomon having left these behind. The Song of Song titles itself after Solomon, saying this is Solomon's Song of Songs, his finest song. And that name, Solomon, in the title is part of the chiastic structure of the book, so there's really no reason to assume it wasn't original or that it was added later. Ecclesiastes does not identify itself specifically as being written by or authored by Solomon, but the profile of the speaker in the book fits Solomon very, very well. In fact, it only really fits Solomon of all the kings that we know about. So there honestly really isn't any, and all the profiles do. I mean, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and the Song of Solomon, like all these things fit the profile of Solomon's time period and the things that he was interested in, the things that he did, as recorded for us in Kings and Chronicles. So there really isn't any legitimate reason to say these books didn't come from Solomon. The only real reason to say that is simply that we just don't want to believe it. I mean, honestly, in the end, the only real reason to say that is just we just simply don't want to believe it. We don't want to believe it came from Solomon. Now, it probably, the form that we have it in may very well have been edited by some later writer. That's very, very possible. In fact, I think it's probably quite likely. So in that sense, it's I think probably technically correct to say that someone else wrote this, in the sense that some other scribe eventually. I mean, even in Proverbs, near the end of the book, they outright say the men of Hezekiah wrote these Proverbs down. Hezekiah was a king that came along about 200 years after Solomon. So, yeah, in that sense, it is accurate to say that someone else technically wrote the material that we have. But there's really no reason to assume that this material doesn't go back to Solomon himself. It fits the profile. The 2 of the 3 books outright identify Solomon as the author. Everything that we read in these books comes from someone who fits the background and profile of Solomon as revealed to us in Kings and Chronicles, and frankly, there's just no legitimate reason to deny that this came from Solomon, except for those of us who just flat out don't want to believe that. And there are people who do. I mean, there are people who just don't want to believe it, so they're not going to believe it, for whatever the reason. They've made up their minds, they just don't want to believe it, so that's it. But unless you're one of those people, there really isn't any good reason to assume these books didn't ultimately come from Solomon. Okay.